The sound of boots on her porch steps stopped Abigail Talmadge cold. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, fingers curled tight around the smooth wooden handle of the cast-iron skillet she had snatched from the stove the moment she heard the creak of the third step. That third step always announced visitors. She had never once thought of fixing it. Now she understood why she had left it alone, because warning was everything when you lived alone in Dusthaven, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, and the man who had threatened to take everything from you was still breathing somewhere in the dark. She did not breathe. She did not move. Then a voice came, low and unhurried, as though it belonged to a man who had all the time in the world and owed no apology for the hours he kept. "Miss Talmadge, it is Micah Ford. I am the Marshal out of Carville County. I am not going to knock. I am just going to sit here a while if it is all the same to you." She exhaled, but she did not lower the skillet. The porch boards shifted once, then settled under the weight of a man sitting down. There was the soft metallic breath of a match being struck, and then silence again, thick and watchful, broken only by the distant sound of a coyote testing the night. She moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside with one finger. A man sat in her father's old rocking chair, the one she had never moved because moving it had felt too close to burying him a second time. He was lean but broad in the shoulder, hat pulled low against the October chill, a rifle laid across his knees like a sleeping thing. He was not looking at the window. He was looking out at the road. He did not turn around. She stood there in the dark of her kitchen with the iron skillet still raised, and something moved in her chest that was not fear and was not relief and was not anything she had a clean name for. It was something older than words, something that frightened her precisely because it did not frighten her at all. That was the third night. But to understand what the third night meant, you had to understand what came before. Dusthaven was not a large town. It was not even a particularly notable one. It sat at the junction of two cattle trails in the brushy flatlands of southwest Texas, the kind of place that existed because geography demanded a waypoint and commerce demanded a name for it. In 1882, its population hovered somewhere around 400 souls, depending on the season and depending on how many of those souls the saloon had recently chased off or swallowed whole. There was a general store run by a man named Holloway who kept his thumb on the scale and his opinions on everything. There was a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, presided over by a schoolteacher who was also the pastor's wife and who enforced silence with a look that could stop a grown man's heart. There was the saloon, of course. There was a livery, a blacksmith, a land office, and a small adobe structure that served as the jailhouse, though it rarely held anyone for more than a night. And there was the Talmadge property, half a mile east of town proper, 62 acres of dry grass and rocky soil that Abigail's father, Emmett Talmadge, had worked himself gray and then worked himself into the ground. Emmett Talmadge had died in March of 1882, a respiratory illness that the doctor in town had called consumption, though he was not certain. A hesitation that had cost him Abigail's trust and earned him the distinction of being the only person in town she actively avoided. Emmett had been 51 years old. He had left Abigail a deed to the land, a small but genuine herd of cattle, 11 horses, including a painted mare named Dolers who was smarter than half the men in Dusthaven, and a debt to the Cattlemen's Bank of Carville County that was not enormous but was not comfortable either. Abigail had been 26 years old when her father died, and she had been alone on that property since. She was not weak. No one who knew her would have said she was weak. She had been raised by a quiet, stubborn man who believed that difficulty was the best teacher, and that the land would always tell you the truth about yourself if you paid attention. She could mend fences, manage a herd in the heat of July, negotiate the price of feed without blinking, and make a meal out of circumstances that would have defeated a lesser imagination. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned back in a practical knot, gray eyes that cataloged everything and gave away nothing, and hands that were calloused in the particular way of someone who did not believe in gloves. What she was not was naive. And so when Douglas Crane began expressing an interest in the Talmadge property that summer, she recognized it for what it was immediately. Not admiration, not neighborly affection, hunger. Douglas Crane was 44 years old, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the eastern half of Carville County. He was the kind of man who had become so accustomed to acquisition that the word no had ceased to register as anything other than a temporary inconvenience. He had already absorbed 3 smaller properties in the past 2 years, buying out one family at a price so low it bordered on theft, and simply waiting the other 2 out until their financial misery made the choice for them. The Talmadge property, with its reliable creek access and its position directly between 2 of Crane's existing parcels, was the final piece of something he had been building for years. He came to her door in late June with his hat in his hands and a smile that had been constructed very carefully to look genuine. He offered her $700 for all 62 acres and the cattle and the horses. She told him no, politely, but without any ambiguity. He came back in July with $900. She told him no again. In August, he stopped coming himself. Instead, she began to notice things. One of her fence lines was cut in the night, and 12 of her cattle wandered onto Crane's land before she found them at dawn. When she went to retrieve them, Crane's foreman, a hard-faced man named Sutter, told her the cattle had been found grazing, and that Crane was willing to discuss their return in exchange for a conversation about the property. She brought the sheriff with her. The sheriff was a man named Earl Purcell, and he was not a bad man, but he was a man who understood very clearly who paid the most in property taxes in Carville County, and he treated the recovery of Abigail's cattle as a matter requiring careful diplomacy rather than the simple return of property that belonged to her. She got the cattle back, but she understood, clearly and without any self-deception, that the game had changed. In September, one of her horses was found with its leg broken in a ditch she did not believe it had walked into on its own. She had to put the animal down herself, because the man she hired to help with the property had left 2 weeks earlier without explanation, and she suspected Crane had something to do with that as well. The horse she lost was not Dolar's, but it was a good horse, and she had raised it, and she stood in the field afterward with the gun in her hand, and the silence pressing in around her, and she did not cry, not then, because she was too angry to give herself permission. October came in with a cold front and a dry wind and a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before something broke. It was the second week of October when she found the note. It had been slipped under her front door sometime in the night, written in a crude hand on a torn piece of brown paper, and it said, "You should take the money and go while the going is good. The next thing that happens won't be a horse." She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her father's rifle laid out before her, cleaned and loaded, and she thought very carefully about what she was going to do. She would not run. That was not even a question. Her father had broken his back and his health on this land, and she would not sign it over to Douglas Crane for any price, and certainly not out of fear. But she was also one woman alone, and she was honest enough with herself to know that honesty and courage were not the same thing as being bulletproof. The next morning she rode into Dusthaven and asked Earl Purcell to investigate the threat. Earl Purcell looked at the note, scratched the back of his neck, and told her it was probably just someone jawing and she should not put too much weight on it. He handed the note back to her. He did not write anything down. She rode home with the note in her coat pocket, and a cold clarity sitting in her chest where her patience had been. She sent a letter that afternoon, riding to the post office in Dusthaven and paying the postage herself, addressed to the United States Marshal's office in Carville County, which was the county seat, 23 miles to the north. She wrote calmly and with precision, laying out every incident in order with dates and descriptions, and she asked for assistance. She did not expect anyone to come. Micah Ford arrived 4 days later. She was at the fence line on the north side of the property when she heard the horse on the road and looked up to see a man riding a gray gelding at a steady walk. Not fast, not slow, exactly the pace of someone who intended to arrive without startling anyone. He wore a dark coat and a hat the color of worn saddle leather, and when he stopped at the gate, she could see the marshal's badge on his coat, catching the afternoon light with a flat, unremarkable gleam. He looked at her across the distance between the fence and the road with a kind of quiet attention that was different from the way most men looked at a woman alone on a property. It was not assessing. It was not dismissive. It was simply the look of someone who was gathering information and reserving judgment. "Miss Talmadge," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. "That is me," she said. "Micah Ford, out of the Marshal's office in Carville County. I received your letter." She walked to the gate and let him in. He was 32 years old, she estimated, though his eyes had the quality of someone older, the kind of steadiness that comes not from years alone but from what fills them. He was not a handsome man in any showy sense of the word, but there was a precision to his face, a jaw that looked like it had been decided upon rather than grown, and a quality of stillness in the way he held himself that she found, despite everything, reassuring. His hands were careful on the reins. His horse was well kept and calm. These things told her things. He dismounted and walked with her toward the porch, and she told him everything, laid it out the same way she had in the letter, calmly and in order. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked 3 questions, each of them precise. Did she have documentation of the original fence damage? Had anyone witnessed the note being delivered? And was the man named Sutter who had held her cattle still employed by Crane? She answered all 3, and he wrote the answers in a small notebook with a short pencil that he put back in his coat pocket when he was done. "I will need to speak to the sheriff," he said. "He will not be helpful," she said. "I know," he said, without any surprise in his voice. "But I need to speak to him anyway. Then I would like to speak to some people in town." He spent 2 days in Dusthaven. She knew because she asked Holloway at the general store, who was always willing to talk about other people's business, and Holloway said the marshal had been in speaking to 4 different people, including the land office clerk and the man who had run the feed account for her father. He had also ridden out to the Crane property, which Abigail learned from a woman named Clara Brent, whose husband worked on the Crane operation, and who had a complicated relationship with loyalty that leaned, ultimately, toward gossip. On the 3rd day, Micah Ford came back to her property. She was in the yard splitting wood when he rode up, and she stopped and watched him approach, the axe still in her hand. He did not look alarmed by the axe. He tied his horse to the porch rail and came to stand a reasonable distance away, and she noticed, not for the first time, that he had a quality she could only describe as the absence of performance. Most men, when they came to speak to a woman alone, performed something, authority or helpfulness or interest or a combination of all 3 arranged for maximum effect. Micah Ford performed nothing. He simply arrived. "I spoke to Douglas Crane," he said, and he denied any knowledge of the note. He denied directing anyone to cut your fence or injure your property. He paused. He was very calm about it. "Men who have been doing wrong things for a long time usually are," she said. Something shifted in his expression then, just barely, something that in another man she might have called a smile, but that in him was more like the movement of light across still water. There and then not there. "That is true," he said. I told him that the marshal's office was aware of the situation, and that any further incidents on or near the Talmadge property would be investigated as criminal matter. "Do you think that will stop him?" "I think it will slow him," he said. "Men like Crane understand institutional interference. They build their tactics around the assumption that no one is paying attention. Once someone is paying attention, they recalibrate. And while he recalibrates, I would like to remain in the area a few more days," he said. "If that is acceptable to you." She looked at him. "Are you asking my permission to do your job?" "I am asking your permission to stay near your property," he said. "That is a different thing." She told him yes. It seemed like the reasonable answer. He made camp the first night by the creek, which she considered excessive discretion and slightly maddening in approximately equal measure. The temperature had dropped and she had a perfectly functional barn with empty stalls and clean hay, and she said so when she brought him coffee the next morning, more out of practicality than any other consideration, and he accepted the coffee and thanked her and said the creek suited him fine. She did not argue. She went back inside. She stood at the window for longer than she intended to, watching nothing in particular, or perhaps watching one particular thing, which was the distant shape of a man who had chosen to stay. That evening, when the light was going orange and long across the dry grass, she brought him supper because she had made enough for two and there was no logical reason not to. He was sitting on a flat rock by the creek, and he received the plate with a kind of simple gratitude that had nothing complicated in it, and they sat in the near dark without much conversation, and she found, to her own bewilderment, that the silence between them was not uncomfortable. She asked him how he had come to be a marshal. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of evasion but the quiet of someone who did not produce answers before they were ready. "I grew up in Missouri," he said. "My father was a farmer. Not a particularly good one, but a consistent one. He believed in doing things correctly even when correctly was harder than the alternative. I suppose that stuck." "That does not explain the badge," she said. "No," he said. "I was in the war. After the war, things were uncertain for a long time. I did some work I am not proud of. Then I did some work I am. The marshal's job is the latter kind." She did not press further. There was something about the way he had said it, the weight of it measured and even, that told her he was not withholding out of shame, but out of the understanding that some things required an invitation to speak of properly, and that this was not yet the moment. What she noticed instead was the way he held his coffee cup, both hands unhurried, as if warmth was something worth paying attention to. The way he looked at the creek, not through it or past it but at it, with the same quality of attention he turned on everything. The way he did not fill silence with himself. The second night he did not camp by the creek. She found him in the morning on the porch, asleep in her father's rocking chair with his rifle across his knees and his hat pulled down against the cold. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, the door held half open, and looked at him. He woke, the way certain people do, instantly and completely, without the slow scramble of confusion, and he looked at her with the same steadiness he always wore, and he said good morning as though nothing unusual had occurred. She said good morning back. She brought him coffee. She wanted to ask him why he had moved from the creek to the porch. She did not ask, partly because she thought she already knew, and partly because saying it aloud would have required her to acknowledge something she was not yet ready to sit with fully. Someone had threatened her. He had moved himself between her door and whatever might come through the night. It was that simple and that complicated simultaneously, and she found herself doing what she always did when something moved her, which was focusing on the practical and trusting the deeper thing to settle in its own time. "Do you want eggs?" she said. "If it is not any trouble," he said. "It is never any trouble to make food for someone who has been sitting in the cold all night on my behalf," she said, and went back inside before either of them could decide what to do with that. It was that morning, over eggs and the last of the bread she had baked 2 days ago, that she learned more about the thing he had said the night before, about work he was not proud of. He did not offer it. She asked, because she had spent enough years alone and enough years watching her father choose silence over honesty to understand that silence was not always the same as peace. "What was the work you were not proud of?" she said. He put his fork down with the deliberateness of someone who was accepting a serious question as the serious thing it was. "After the war I rode for a man named Carruthers out of Arkansas," he said. "He called himself a land agent. He was, in fact, someone who acquired land from people who had no power to refuse and sold it to people who did not ask how it was acquired. I did not know that for the first 6 months. By the time I understood it, I had already done things that made me a part of it. I rode away from it, but riding away was not the same as being clean. What did you do about it? She said. I testified, he said. When Carruthers was eventually arrested, I went to the court and I said everything I knew. He went to prison. Several families got their land back, not all of them, not enough, but some. She looked at him across the table. That took courage, she said. It took less courage than doing the right thing in the first place would have, he said. I try not to confuse the two. This was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said in her kitchen in years, possibly ever. Her father had been an honest man, but he was honest the way rocks were honest, the same in all directions, not particularly complicated. What Micah Ford was doing was something more deliberate. He was being honest about the shape of his own failures, which was an entirely different and far more difficult thing. She refilled his coffee without being asked. He said, "Thank you, Miss Talmadge." She said, "Abigail." Something in him went very still for just a moment. Then he said, "Abigail," and it had exactly the weight of something being held carefully. The second day passed in a kind of heightened ordinariness. He spent the morning riding the perimeter of the property in a systematic way that suggested he was memorizing it, and she watched him from the yard while she worked and did not pretend she was not watching. In the afternoon, he rode into town and came back in the early evening, and he told her he had spoken again with the land office clerk, a man named Peterson, who had let slip, under what the Marshal described as some persistent but not threatening encouragement, that Crane had filed a complaint with the county about the debt Abigail owed on the property, suggesting the bank should call in the loan. Abigail set her coffee mug down on the porch railing very carefully. "He cannot do that," she said. "The loan is not in default. I have made every payment." "You have," he said. "I checked." "Then how?" "He has influence at the county level," Micah said. "Not legal authority, but influence. He is trying to create pressure from multiple directions at once. Financial pressure, physical fear, and the implicit suggestion that you have no institutional support. He is counting on you to be exhausted by all three before he has to take any one of them to its conclusion." She stood very still with the cold evening coming down around her and felt the old anger move through her, clean and strengthening. "He has miscalculated," she said quietly. "Yes," said Micah Ford. "I believe he has." She looked at him. "Can you stop the bank from acting on his suggestion? I have already sent a letter to the Cattlemen's Bank stating that the Marshal's office is investigating potential fraudulent misrepresentation of the Talmadge account status," he said. "That should give them sufficient reason to proceed carefully. Banks do not enjoy being mentioned in legal correspondence." She almost laughed. Not a bright laugh, but something wry and real, and she saw him register it, the slight shift of attention, as though her laughter was something he found worth noticing. "You think of things in advance," she said. "It is the job," he said. "No," she said. "It is you." He did not answer that. But he did not look away either, and in the space between what she had said and what neither of them said after it, there was something present that had not been there before. That night again he sat on her porch. She brought him a blanket this time, a thick wool one that had been her father's, dark red with a pattern of lines running through it. She handed it through the door without ceremony and said, "It will be cold tonight," and he said, "Thank you," and she went inside. She lay in her bed in the dark and listened to the silence of the property around her, and somewhere beneath the silence she was aware, steadily, and with a quality she could not entirely dismiss, that the man on her porch was between her and whatever the night held. That awareness had a texture to it, a warmth. She told herself it was simply the rational comfort of institutional protection, and then lay there in the dark for a long time, understanding that she was lying to herself. The third morning, she rose before dawn. She had not slept well, not from fear but from the kind of restlessness that comes when something in you is shifting and not yet complete. She dressed and went to the kitchen and made biscuits because biscuits required attention, and she needed something that required attention. The The sky was going from black to deep blue to the first pale announcement of light when she heard the third step creak on the porch and then his voice, telling her who he was, and that he was just going to sit a while if it was all the same to her. And she had stood with the skillet raised in the dark, already knowing before she moved to the window. She watched him in her father's chair in the pre-dawn dark with the rifle across his knees, and something moved in her chest that was not a small thing. She lowered the skillet. She set it on the stove. She put the biscuits in the oven and stood at the window once more, watching the shape of him, the stillness of him, the absolute and uncomplicated presence of a man who had simply decided to stay. When the biscuits were done, she opened the front door fully. He turned to look at her then. The first gray light was on his face. His eyes were darker than she had expected up close, brown but deep, the kind of brown that had other colors inside it. "Come in," she said. "I made biscuits." He rose from the chair and came inside, and she thought she heard him breathe differently as he crossed the threshold, as though the simple act of being invited in was a thing that required adjusting to. He set his rifle beside the door, and she appreciated that he had put it down without being asked, the way you put something down when you are trying to say something without saying it. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with biscuits and coffee, and the morning light coming in yellow through the east window, and she told herself she was going to ask him something practical about the situation with Crane, and instead what came out was, "How long will you stay?" He looked at her. Not as though the question surprised him, but as though it was a question he had already considered from more than one direction. "As long as you need," he said. Then after a pause, "As long as you want." She looked at him very directly. "Those are two different things," she said. "Yes," he said, "they are." She picked up a biscuit and broke it in half because her hands needed something to do. "I'm not accustomed to kneading," she said. "I grew up with a father who believed kneading was a kind of weakness. I think he was wrong, but the habit is deep." "Your father was wrong," he said simply. She looked up. "You did not know him." "I know what that belief produces," he said. "I had the same one for a long time. And now." He looked out the window at the morning for a moment, and when he looked back at her there was something open in his face that she did not think was easy for him. "Now I think needing people is just what people do. Refusing it does not make you independent, it makes you alone." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched. Then she looked down at her biscuit. She said, "I would like you to stay." She heard him set his coffee cup down. She looked up. "Then I will stay," he said. What happened next happened over the following days, with the unhurried logic of things that are inevitable but not rushed. He did not move into the house. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman, and the particular moment they were in required a particular kind of patience that both of them seemed to understand without discussing it. He moved from the porch to the barn, which was warmer and which she had offered without any charged significance, and he took the offer in the same spirit. He worked. This surprised her, or rather, it surprised her how little she had expected it. He mended the fence line that had been cut in August without being asked, the spare wire and fencing tools in the barn telling him everything he needed to know about the task. He found a rotting board on the side of the barn and replaced it. He helped her move the cattle to the south pasture when the north pasture grass ran thin, working beside her without commentary, doing his share of the physical labor with an ease that told her this was not the first time he had done it. She watched him work and thought about the letter she had written to the Marshal's office in October, the way she had written it out of necessity and not out of any expectation of genuine help. She thought about the weight of a year spent managing her father's death and her father's debt, and Douglas Crane's encroachments largely alone. She thought about how much energy she had used simply in the maintenance of appearing adequate to the task, how much of herself had gone into the performance of being fine. She thought about what it felt like to watch someone else lift some of the weight. On the fourth day, Micah rode into Dusthaven and came back in the early afternoon with information that changed the shape of everything. He found her in the yard and dismounted, and his expression was the particular kind of control that people use when they have important news and are deciding how to deliver it. "Crane had a meeting at the land office this morning," he said. "I spoke with Peterson, who told me he had filed a formal petition to the county court claiming that the Talmadge property constitutes an unworked parcel under the abandonment provisions of the Texas Property Code." She stared at him. "That provision applies to property that has been unoccupied for more than 2 consecutive years. I live here. I have worked this land every day since my father died." "I know," he said. "The petition is frivolous." But frivolous petitions still require response, and the county court sits on the second Tuesday of every month. The next session is 11 days away. What do I need to do? I need you to gather everything that documents your continuous occupation and active work of this property. Every receipt, every sale record, every bill paid, every neighbor who can testify to your presence here. I am going to draft a formal response to the petition on behalf of the Marshal's office, and I am going to be at that court session." She looked at him for a long moment. "You do not have to do all of this," she said, not as a complaint, but as a genuine observation. "I want to," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that made it sound like duty. She went inside and began going through her father's desk, the wooden roll-top that sat in the corner of the sitting room that she had not fully sorted through since he died, partly out of grief and partly out of the knowledge that inside it was the full accounting of everything that had gone wrong and everything she still owed. Micah sat across from her at the table as the afternoon went on, reading through documents she passed him, making notes in his small book, asking occasional precise questions. They worked until the light was entirely gone, and she lit the lamp and they went on working by lamplight. And at some point she realized she had not eaten and neither had he, and she got up and made supper without ceremony, and they ate at the desk with the papers around them, and none of it felt strange. This, she thought, looking at him bent over a sale receipt from the spring herd sale, was what it looked like when someone was on your side. It was a thought that hit her with a force she had not prepared for. She had been on her own side. She had her father's side when he was alive. She had her own counsel and her own competence and her own determination, and those things had been enough to survive on. But they were not the same thing as this. This was something that had a different weight entirely, warm and substantial, and it scared her in the specific way that only good things could scare her, which was the fear not of harm but of loss, the knowledge that the good thing existed and could therefore be taken away. That night she lay awake again, and this time she let herself acknowledge plainly what she felt, the way she watched for him when he was not in her sight, the way his voice had a quality that settled something in her chest that was usually unsettled, the way she thought about what he had said about needing people, and found herself thinking he was the person she would most want to test that theory with. She acknowledged all of it and then lay in the dark with it, quiet, the way her father had always told her to sit with difficult ground before you decided how to work it. In the morning she made coffee for 2 without thinking about it. She did not think about it until she was already pouring the second cup, and then she smiled at the second cup and did not try to put the smile away. He knocked on the kitchen door, which he always did, and she said come in, which she always said, and he came in and sat down and she put the coffee in front of him, and he looked at it and then up at her and he said, "You already made it." "Of course," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Something that was not quite a smile and was entirely too much like one, and she turned back to the stove so she did not have to decide what to do with her own expression. The days leading up to the court session had a particular quality of controlled urgency. Micah continued to gather testimony. He spoke to 2 ranchers east of town who had seen Abigail working her cattle in the summer. He spoke to Holloway at the general store, who, when presented with the specific and somewhat pointed observation that his own business depended on the goodwill of his customers, and that customers tended to remember how he behaved in times of difficulty, produced 3 years of receipts showing consistent purchases by Abigail Talmadge, feed and tools and wire and seed, the unmistakable paper trail of a working property. He spoke to the doctor in town, who confirmed that he had visited the Talmadge property in March to attend to Emmett Talmadge, and that Abigail had been present and managing the property throughout. Abigail, for her part, was not idle. She was also not willing to simply wait for the institutions to function on her behalf, a faith she did not entirely have. She wrote to the Cattlemen's Bank herself, formal and precise, referencing the Marshal's correspondence and asking for written confirmation of her account status. She got it within 4 days, a letter confirming she was current and in good standing, a letter she folded very carefully and put in the envelope with the other documents. She also, on a Thursday evening when the autumn light was going golden and sharp, asked Micah if he would like to walk the property with her, not to assess the fence lines, not to check the cattle, just to walk. He said yes, and they went out together into the late afternoon, and she showed him things she did not usually show people. The place by the creek where the wild pecans grew, and where her father used to spend Sunday mornings in the fall, filling a sack and being, for an hour, simply a man who liked pecans and quiet. The low flat rock in the south field that caught the last of the sun, and held it long after the shade had taken the rest of the land, and where she sometimes sat in the evenings when the loneliness was heavier than usual. The ridge of higher ground to the east, where on clear mornings you could see the distant silver thread of another creek 20 miles away, and her father had told her, when she was young, that following water was the oldest wisdom and the oldest faith. She did not talk about loneliness directly, but she talked around the edges of it, and he listened with that quality he had of making the speaker feel that what they were saying was being taken in completely, not processed for a response, but actually received. He talked, too, a little. He told her about the gray gelding, whose name was Cass, and who had been given to him by an old rancher in Guadalupe County, whose property he had helped recover after a fraudulent land scheme. He said the rancher had pressed the horse on him as payment, and he had at first declined, and the rancher had told him, with considerable force, that a man who could not accept a gift would always be poor in the ways that mattered. He had accepted the horse. "Did he change your mind?" she asked. "About accepting things?" He looked at her sidelong as they walked. "He started the argument," he said. "I am still working on finishing it." She nodded slowly. "So am I," she said. They stood for a while on the low ridge, looking east at the silver thread of that distant creek, and the sun was nearly gone, and the first stars were already out in the east, and she was aware of him beside her with the particular awareness of two people who are in the process of choosing each other without yet having said so aloud. He said quietly, looking at the distance, "Abigail." "Yes," she said, turning to look at him. He looked at her with an expression that was very open, and openness in a man like him, she understood, was not a small thing. It was the most he knew how to offer, and it was, she thought, more than enough. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "that I did not come here only because of the letter." She looked at him. "You had not met me before you came." "No," he said, "but I read your letter 3 times. There was something in the way you wrote it, the way you laid every fact out in order without plea and without dramatics, just the truth in sequence. And at the end you said you were asking for assistance, not for rescue, that you could manage the land and you could manage the threat, but institutional backing would make the difference. And I thought to myself, that is a person I would like to meet." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And having met me," he looked at her steadily. "I would like not to leave," he said. The court session was 9 days later, and it was held in the Carville County Courthouse, which was a serious stone building in the county seat that was the most formal structure Abigail had set foot in since her father's funeral. She wore her best dress, the dark blue one she kept pressed and ready for occasions that required the declaration that she took herself seriously. Micah wore a clean coat and his badge. They rode in together in the morning, 23 miles on the main road, and the quality of the ride was such that she did not feel the distance. Crane was already there when they arrived, with his lawyer, a man from San Antonio named Beauchamp, who had the polished look of someone who had never done anything that left a visible mark. Crane looked at Abigail when she came through the courthouse door and then looked at Micah beside her, and something went very tight in Crane's face that he controlled, and Abigail watched him control it, and felt a cold satisfaction that was not meanness but was close. The county judge was a man named Harlow Briggs, 60 years old, with white hair and the particularly unhurried expression of a man who had heard every kind of foolishness over a long career, and found he was no longer impressed by any of it. He took the testimony, he examined the documents, and he listened to Beauchamp's argument for the petition with the patient attention of someone who is waiting for the argument to end rather than the argument to make its case. Micah presented the marshal's response, the account records, the witness statements, the receipts, the letter from the bank. He spoke without drama and without aggression, plainly and in order, and Abigail watched the judge reading each document, and listened to the silence in the room and made herself breathe. Judge Briggs dismissed the petition before lunch. He also delivered from the bench a pointed observation that filing legally frivolous petitions for the purpose of harassment was a matter he took seriously, and that any further petitions of similar character from any party would result in consequences rather than dismissal. He looked at Beauchamp when he said this, and Beauchamp looked at his papers. Crane left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Beauchamp followed him. Outside on the courthouse steps in the late morning sunshine, Abigail stood and breathed the clear air and felt something unknot in her chest that had been tight since October. Micah stood beside her. He was not touching her. He did not need to. The presence of him was sufficient. "It is not over," he said quietly. "He still wants the land, but he has now been publicly denied and officially noted. The legal route is closed. The intimidation route has been noted by the marshal's office. His calculus has changed significantly." "You think he will stop?" she said. "I think he will try something else," he said. "Probably something that requires more patience than the last approaches." Men like him are not short on patience, but patience without a viable angle is just waiting. He does not have a viable angle anymore. She turned to look at him. "What happens now?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Whatever you want to happen," he said. She said, "Come home." The ride back was different from the ride out. The urgency was gone, or rather it had been replaced by something that had its own kind of gravity, quieter and steadier. They rode side by side in the afternoon light, not talking much, comfortable in the way of people who have already said the important things and are now simply occupying the same space, which was its own language. When they came to the gate of the Talmadge property, she stopped her horse and looked at the land, the 62 acres of dry grass and rocky soil and creek and fence and sky, and she felt it settle back into her, solid and hers, and she thought of her father, who had believed in this land even when it was hard, and she thought that if he were watching he might find it acceptable that she had not given it up. She also thought that he might have said something sensible about the man who had ridden back with her, something direct and dry, because her father had been direct and dry about most things, and she thought he would probably have liked Micah Ford. He had always respected a man who kept his word and did his work without fanfare, and Micah Ford was that thing so completely it seemed to be what he was made of. That evening was the first evening that felt, entirely and without reservation, like peace. She made a proper supper, the best she could manage from what was in the larder, a beef stew with the last of the fall root vegetables and cornbread, and she set the table properly, and Micah came in from checking the horses and washed up at the basin and sat down, and they ate by lamplight, and the conversation ranged widely. From the legal particulars of the property code to the migratory patterns of the cattle herds through this part of Texas, to whether the pecans by the creek were worth harvesting before the freeze, to what Micah had done in the years between Arkansas and the Marshal's badge, and what Abigail had done in the year between her father's death and October, and what she had thought about alone in this house, in the long intervals between one small crisis and the next. She told him about loneliness plainly now, without the sideways approach. She told him it had been a particular and specific kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone in a crowd, but the loneliness of being genuinely, structurally alone, of having no one who was looking out for the same things she was looking out for, of carrying every responsibility and every fear and every decision herself, and how it had not broken her but it had made her very careful, very defended. In a way that she was now starting to understand might have been necessary then, and was less necessary now. He listened. When she finished, he said, "I was lonely in Missouri after I left Caruthers. I stayed in a boarding house in Springfield for 4 months doing nothing of consequence, and I understood what you mean about carrying things alone. I found that I could do it, that I was sufficient to it, but that sufficient was not the same as good." "No," she said, "it is not." He looked at her across the table, lamplight finding the planes of his face. "I think I have been sufficient for long enough," he said. She looked at him. She felt herself at the edge of something, the way you feel at the edge of high ground before you step off it, not fearless but willing. "So have I," she said. He reached across the table and set his hand beside hers. Not on hers. Beside hers, close enough to touch, offering without taking. And she turned her hand over and his fingers settled into the space of her palm, warm and certain, and that was the whole of it, the entirety of the declaration made in that gesture, and it was more than enough. November came in hard. The first real frost came the second week of the month, laying a thin white sheet over everything by morning and burning off by 9 o'clock, and Abigail stood on the porch in the early cold drinking her coffee, and thinking that the land looked, under frost, like it was being held. Micah had ridden back to Carville County at the end of October, which had been a practical necessity he had stated and she had accepted, and which had produced in both of them a particular quality of absence, the kind that confirms the presence it is missing. He had been gone for 12 days. In those 12 days she had received 2 letters. The first was professional, an update on the Marshal's office having placed a formal note in Crane's file at the county level, and an assurance that Crane's movements relative to the Talmadge property were being watched. The second was not professional. The second was handwritten in the same careful precision as his speech, and it said, "I find myself thinking about the creek and the pecans and the supper table more than is strictly necessary for a man who has other things to attend to. I intend to come back before December if you are amenable. I think you know I am not asking only about the property situation." She had read it twice standing at the kitchen window, and then set it on the table and put the iron on the stove to press her apron and thought for a long time about things she had not thought about in years. Things like what it would mean to build something with another person, what it required to trust that much, what you had to be willing to lose and what you might, in the offering, gain. She wrote back. She said, "Come before the freeze if you can. The pecans are ready. I have been leaving them." He arrived on November 8th on the gray gelding Cass in the late afternoon with a cold wind at his back and the light going fast. She heard the third step and came to the door and opened it, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with an expression she had seen building for weeks, something that was now fully present, nothing held back or arranged. She said, "You made it before the freeze," he said. "I told you I would." She stood back from the door and he came inside. The days that followed were, in the exact sense of the word, courtship. It was not hurried. Neither of them was young in the particular way that mistakes them for having infinite time to waste, but neither of them had the kind of impetuosity that substitutes speed for substance. They talked every evening. They worked through the days, him riding out with her to manage the cattle, helping her prepare the property for the hard months ahead, weatherproofing the barn, cutting and stacking wood, putting the garden beds down for the winter. The labor was companionable in a way she had not experienced before, the particular satisfaction of 2 people who each know what they are doing, working in coordination, without unnecessary negotiation. He told her about his family. His mother had died when he was 11, consumption, the same thing that had taken her father, and the similarity was something that sat between them for a moment when he said it, acknowledged without being dwelt on. His father had remarried, a woman from Sedalia who was practical and direct and not unkind, and he had two half-brothers he saw occasionally and thought of with affection but not closeness. He had no property, no particular place he was tied to, nothing in Carville County that was his beyond the job and the boarding room he rented from a widow named Henderson. She said, "Are you happy there?" He looked at her across the barn where they were stacking hay. "I have been adequate there," he said. "For a long time I did not distinguish between the two." She nodded slowly. "What would make you happy?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "This," he said, and the word was simple and direct as a nail into wood, carrying exactly the weight it needed to carry and no more. She looked at him. She was holding a hay fork, and she was dusty from the work, and her hair had come half down from its pin, and she was aware that she looked nothing like someone in a particular moment of life, and she thought that might be exactly right, that the real things happened when you were dusty and honest and not arranged. "Me too," she said. In the second week of November, on a Sunday when the sky was clear and very high, and the cold had a brightness in it rather than a threat, he asked her to marry him. They were at the pecan trees by the creek. She had brought a cloth sack, and they had been filling it, unhurried, the pecans dropping into the bag in the way that repetitive and satisfying work has of clearing the mind down to its essentials. He had stopped working, and she had looked up, and he was standing on the other side of the tree looking at her through the branches. He said, "I would like to stay here, not as the marshal watching your property, as the man who is yours and who you are his if you will have it. If you will have me." She looked at him for a long time. The creek was running behind him, low and clear in the November cold, and the sky was enormous and pale above the bare pecan branches. "Micah," she said, "I was alone on this property for 8 months after my father died, and before that I had never lived as anything other than a farmer's daughter who was made to be practical. I have never been certain about very many things. I am certain about this." He crossed the space between them, moving around the tree, and he stood in front of her, and he took her face in his hands with the same carefulness he gave to everything that mattered, and he kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that had nothing in it of taking and everything in it of arriving. She held the cloth sack of pecans in one hand and his coat in the other, and was, in that moment, entirely and without reservation happy. They married on December 14th, 1882, in the schoolhouse that doubled as a church in Dusthaven, in a ceremony performed by the pastor, attended by perhaps 30 people, which was most of the people in town who were not Douglas Crane or closely associated with him. Holloway at the general store attended, looking somewhat surprised to find himself there, but staying the full length of it. The woman named Clara Brent attended with her husband, who had recently left the crane operation after some kind of dispute, and had started work at a ranch farther east. The doctor whom Abigail had never fully forgiven attended, because he had asked very humbly if he might, and she had said yes, because she was choosing not to carry old scores into a new beginning. She wore her blue dress. He wore his good coat and his badge, though she had considered asking him to leave the badge, and then decided against it because the badge was part of who he was, and she had learned to be suspicious of wanting to change the parts of a person that were most essential to them. The pastor read from Ruth, which seemed appropriate, and said words about commitment being not a thing of feeling alone but of will and of action, which seemed very appropriate, and then they said the words to each other, and Micah's voice was steady and low and entirely serious, which was exactly what she had known it would be, and her own voice surprised her by being equally steady, which told her something about how sure she was. After the ceremony there was a modest celebration at the schoolhouse, with coffee and the pies that 3 of the town women had contributed, and the particular atmosphere of a celebration that is genuinely felt rather than performed, which is the rarest kind. Micah had already resigned from the marshal's office in Carville County. He had sent the letter before the ceremony, which she had learned only afterward, and which had moved her in the specific way that premeditated sacrifice does, the knowledge that the decision had been made before the question of whether she would say yes had been answered, which was a form of faith she found herself wanting to be worthy of. The new marshal for the region would be appointed in the spring. Micah had put in a recommendation for a younger man he trusted, a fact that pleased her both because it suggested he had been building relationships in his work with the same quality of care he brought to everything else. He had experience enough with cattle and property management to be genuinely useful on the 62 acres, and between his knowledge and hers they were, she calculated, a formidable combination. She had already begun to think about what they could build together in the years ahead. The herd expanded, the south pasture properly cultivated, possibly a second barn in the spring. January came in cold and white and close, and they spent it together in the house that was now theirs, working through the indoor tasks of the hard season, repairing tack and tools, mending clothing, going over the accounts with an eye toward the coming year. The evenings were long and lamplit and warm, and she thought she would not have guessed 2 years ago that the loneliness she had been so disciplined about containing could resolve so completely into its opposite. Micah read in the evenings when the work was done. He had a small collection of books, 6 of them, that he had brought in his saddlebag, which she found inexplicably moving, the image of a man who traveled light keeping books among the things he could not abandon. She read beside him, and they occasionally read aloud to each other, not systematically, but when something struck one of them as worth sharing, and the sound of his voice in the lamplit room was something she found herself listening for and being satisfied by in a way that had the quality of answered hunger. In February, she told him she thought she might be expecting. They were at the table after supper, and she said it the way she said most things, directly and without preliminary, and he looked up from the book he had been reading, and the expression that crossed his face was so complete and so unguarded that she felt it physically, the joy of it moving through the space between them. He set the book down. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his, and he said, "Are you all right? Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling fine," she said. "Better than fine." He pressed his forehead briefly to her hands, a gesture so intimate and so quiet that she felt it lodge somewhere very deep and stay there. "A child," he said, as though the word needed to be spoken aloud to be believed. "Apparently," she said, and found herself smiling. He looked up at her. "I did not know how much I wanted this," he said. "I had not let myself know." "I know the feeling," she said, and squeezed his hands. Spring came early in 1883, the warmth arriving before anyone quite expected it, and the property responded the way land does when it has been well tended, with a generosity that looked effortless but was actually the accumulated return on seasons of careful work. The cattle were healthy. The south pasture was being turned for cultivation. The second barn had been framed in March by Micah, and 2 men he had hired from town, young men who worked hard and took direction well, and who seemed to regard the marshal-turned-rancher with a respect that Abigail found appropriate. Douglas Crane had been quiet since November. Abigail had heard through the network of information that ran through Clara Brent's kitchen that Crane had acquired a property to the west, in a different direction entirely, which seemed to confirm Micah's assessment that without a viable angle Crane defaulted to other targets. She did not celebrate this. Crane's displacement of his hunger onto another smaller property owner was not a solution she was at peace with, and she said so to Micah, and he told her he had already sent a note to the new marshal about Crane's pattern of behavior. It was not nothing. It was the institutional record that might, in time, reach the tipping point of consequence. "That is the most honest thing about this kind of work," he said. "You rarely solve the whole problem. You create the conditions in which the problem can eventually be solved." She thought about this. "That requires a lot of faith in eventually," she said. "Yes," he said, "it does." She decided she had that faith. Or she decided to act as though she did, which her father had always told her was the same thing in practice. Her pregnancy moved through the spring and summer without serious difficulty. She was tired in the early months, more than she had expected, and the tiredness had an unfamiliar quality, a pervasive heaviness that she could not simply push through, and Micah watched her manage this with a steadiness that required her to let herself be looked after in a way that was still sometimes difficult and was becoming less so. He took on the heavier outdoor work without comment. He made supper on the nights when she fell asleep in the chair before dark. He rode to Dusthaven for supplies without needing to be asked, intuiting the household needs with a quiet attentiveness that she found increasingly to be one of the fundamental pleasures of not being alone. She noticed in the summer that he had put new boards in the porch, not just the section that needed it, the whole porch, every board replaced and sealed against the weather. She mentioned it one evening standing on the newly solid wood. "When did you do this?" she said. "April," he said. "You were resting." "You fixed the third step," she said. He looked at her. "It was time," he said. Then, after a pause, the warning served its purpose. She looked at him for a long moment, thinking of October, thinking of the creak of that step in the pre-dawn dark, thinking of his voice saying he was just going to sit a while. She thought of all the things that had moved between them in the architecture of those early days, the careful and deliberate and unspoken choices that had accumulated into a life. "Yes," she said, "it did." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him in the evening warmth, and the property stretched out around them, theirs in every direction, and the child moved inside her with the preliminary quality of something that was becoming ready, and the sky over southwest Texas was going rose and gold in the west, and the creek was catching the light in small, bright fragments. Their son was born on September 2nd, 1883. He came in the early morning, quickly enough that the doctor from town, summoned the previous evening, arrived with an hour to spare rather than the 2 he would have liked. Micah was present throughout, which the doctor noted with some surprise and Abigail noted with a gratitude she would not have known to anticipate, but which, once present, seemed like the only way it could have been. They named him Micah Ford, which combined the 2 things she most wanted to carry forward, her father's name and her husband's, in that order, which Micah had suggested himself, and which she had accepted with the particular feeling of being known. Ford was, from the first, a quiet and watchful baby, which his parents found entirely fitting and only slightly alarming. He had his father's quality of stillness, which emerged, against all probability, even in infancy, and his mother's gray eyes, which at 3 weeks old already seemed to be cataloging things. Dusthaven received the news of the birth with the warmth that small communities reserve for events that remind them of themselves. Holloway at the general store sent a sack of sugar and a note that was, for Holloway, almost effusive. Clara Brent came out with a quilt she had pieced herself over the winter, deep blue and cream, which Abigail used for the baby's cradle and would later use for him when he outgrew it. The pastor's wife came and sat with Abigail for 2 hours and was, without the pressure of occasion or formality, genuinely good company. The sheriff, Earl Purcell, came too. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands and a somewhat uncomfortable expression and offered congratulations, and Abigail looked at him with her clear gray eyes and said thank you without warmth and without coldness, a perfectly calibrated neutral that told him exactly where they stood, which was at the beginning of a long road to being square. He accepted this with what appeared to be genuine humility, which she gave him credit for, and he left, and she thought they might manage a working civil relationship in time, which was enough to ask for. By October, 6 months after Emmett's birth, the property had achieved a new rhythm, the rhythm of a household that had organized itself around a child with the same practical attention it had given to everything else. The cattle operation was performing better than the previous year. Micah had negotiated a sale arrangement with a buyer in San Antonio that secured better prices than the local market had offered, leveraging a connection from his years in Carville County. And the difference in income, was sufficient to pay off the remaining balance of the bank debt in a single payment that Abigail made in person, riding to the Cattlemen's Bank in Carville County on a clear October morning with the bank draft in her coat pocket and a satisfaction in her chest that was warm and complete. She told the bank clerk she would be closing the account and conducting her banking in Dusthaven going forward, which was not the most financially strategic decision, but was one she felt was correct. The bank clerk took the draft and the account closure without visible emotion, which she respected. She rode home to her husband and her son and her 62 acres and the flat rock in the south field and the pecans by the creek and the porch that now creaked on no particular step. And she thought about the story of how she had come to this life, and she found that all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, was something she could trace with gratitude, because each difficulty had produced something necessary. The note under the door had produced the letter to the Marshal. The letter to the Marshal had produced Micah Ford. Micah Ford, on 3 nights on her porch in the October dark, had produced everything that came after. She turned Dolors, the painted mare, toward the gate and came home. The winter of 1883 was the kind of winter that reminds you why the pioneers who chose the high plains over the gentler east were either courageous or stubborn or both. It came in early and with conviction, and by December the cold was the kind that settled into the bones of the house itself, requiring more wood than they had anticipated, which produced the only period of genuine domestic tension in their first year of marriage. A 3-day difference of opinion about the best way to manage the wood supply that resolved itself when they independently arrived at the same solution from opposite directions, and found this simultaneously funny and annoying, and deeply characteristic of both of them. She told him one evening, by the fire with Emmett asleep in his cradle in the corner, that she thought they argued well, which was a strange thing to say but which she meant seriously, that the quality of the argument, the willingness to state positions fully and the equal willingness to hear the counter, was something she valued. He looked at her. "My mother used to say that the arguments inside a marriage were where the real character of it lived," he said. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise," she said. "She was," he said. "I wish I had known her longer." She reached over and put her hand on his, and they sat by the fire with the sleeping baby in his cradle, and the cold outside the walls and the warmth inside them. And she thought this was what people meant when they said home, and almost never managed to say it right, because it was too simple for the words that usually got assigned to it. Spring of 1884 brought changes to Dusthaven that had been accumulating for some time. The railroad, which had been discussed for years as a theoretical possibility, announced a route that would pass through the county and stop at a station 12 miles north of town, which meant that Dusthaven would not itself become a railroad stop, but would be close enough to benefit from the connection. And the ripple effects of this were visible immediately in the form of new investment interest in land and cattle operations throughout the region. This had implications for the Talmadge Ford property, which was well positioned for cattle transport once the line was operational. Micah spent 2 weeks in the spring corresponding with buyers in San Antonio and Austin, and Abigail spent the same 2 weeks going through every piece of paper related to the cattle operation and the property with an eye toward what the next 3 years might look like if they managed the expansion carefully rather than recklessly. They presented their conclusions to each other at the kitchen table one evening with Emmett, now 7 months old, and expressing strong opinions about being held, occupying his father's lap with the air of someone who intended to be included in the meeting. The conclusions were compatible, which they both noted with satisfaction, and they made a joint plan that involved increasing the herd by 30 cattle over the next year and investing in a proper corral setup that would allow for better management of a larger operation. It was a plan. It was also, she thought, watching him hold their son and read over the papers, a life. An actual, built, continuing life, the kind you could look at from the inside and recognize as genuine. Douglas Crane's story, she heard at the end of that spring, had reached a conclusion of its own making. The property he had targeted to the west, a smaller operation run by a Mexican family named the Garcias, had produced a resistance he had not anticipated, partly because the Garcia family had deep local ties and considerable community support, and partly because the new Marshal, acting on the documentation that Micah had provided before his resignation, had opened a formal investigation into Crane's pattern of coercion and intimidation across multiple properties. In May of 1884, Crane was formally charged with criminal conspiracy to defraud two of the families he had previously acquired land from in his earlier acquisitions, the ones where the price had been so low it bordered on theft. Abigail read about this in the Carville County Gazette, which Holloway received and which she had taken to reading regularly. She set the paper down on the table and looked at it for a moment, thinking about the Garcia family, thinking about the two families who had lost land and were now going to court to get some justice for it. She was glad for the charge and glad for the investigation, and under both the gladness was something sober, the knowledge that justice, when it came, always came too late for some part of what had been lost, and that this was one of the things that had to be lived with honestly rather than prettied up. She told Micah about it that evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The new Marshal is good, I knew he would be. You set that in motion," she said. "The documentation you left." "We set it in motion," he said. "Your letter came first." She conceded this with a nod. Their second child came in November of 1884, another autumn arrival, as though the family were seasonal. A girl this time, born at home on a cold Tuesday morning with the same doctor attending, who had by this time been partially forgiven for his uncertain consumption diagnosis, partly because she had decided forgiveness was more useful than grievance and partly because he had been, through both births, competent and calm and genuinely present. They named the girl Clara Ruth Ford. Clara for the woman who had kept Abigail connected to the small currents of information that had sometimes been the only news she had. Ruth for the scripture the pastor had read at their wedding, and for what it had said about staying, about choosing the people you are with and staying with them through whatever comes. Abigail thought Clara and Ruth were both names for the quality of fidelity, which seemed right for a daughter. Emmett, 14 months old and already walking in the purposeful and slightly alarming way of toddlers who have decided that speed is the answer to most questions, received his sister with the expression of someone who has been presented with an unexpected development and is reserving judgment. Within 2 weeks he had decided she was acceptable, a conclusion he communicated by sitting next to her cradle and staring at her with their shared gray eyes in identical expressions of serious evaluation. The December of 1884 was gentler than the previous year, and they used the mild evenings to do the planning they had not been able to do the previous winter, the expansion of the herd, the arrangements for the spring, the ongoing management of a property that was, year by year, becoming something that bore the marks of two people's combined intelligence and care rather than one person's solitary effort. One evening in mid-December, Micah came in from the barn with fresh cold on his coat and set it on the peg by the door, and came to the kitchen where she was nursing Clara and Emmett was on the floor arranging and rearranging a set of wooden blocks with the focused intensity he gave to all physical puzzles. He sat in the chair across from her and looked at her and the baby, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to think of as his real expression, the one that was not maintained for any external purpose, that existed only when he was somewhere safe enough to wear it. "I was thinking today," he said, "about the first morning. On the porch." She looked up. "Which part of it?" "The part before you opened the door," he said. "I did not know then what was going to happen. I did not know that sitting in that chair was going to change the entire direction of my life. I just knew I was not going to leave the porch. I knew that much." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. "Why were you certain of that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you had written an honest letter," he said. and I had spent a long time in work that required me to navigate the dishonest. And I thought, someone who writes that honestly about her situation, who asks for exactly what she needs and no more and no less, who does not perform helplessness or perform strength but just states the truth in sequence, that is someone I want to be around. I had not thought beyond that, but I knew I did not want to leave the porch. She thought about this, about the letter she had written at the kitchen table in October, alone in the house with the cold coming in under the door and the threat in her coat pocket and no particular expectation of rescue. She had written it the only way she knew how to write anything, which was exactly, "That letter saved this land," she said. "That letter brought me here," he said. "The land was always going to be saved. You would have found another way." She smiled at that, because it was not flattery but the specific confidence of a man who had studied her actual character and arrived at an accurate assessment. "Perhaps," she said, "but I am glad it was this way." He reached across and took her free hand, the one not occupied with the baby, and held it with the same care he had always held things that mattered. And Clara made a small satisfied sound and settled. And Emmett placed his blocks in a pattern that satisfied him, and looked up at both his parents with an expression that was, in its totality, the image of his grandmother's wisdom and his grandfather's stubbornness, and his father's stillness and his mother's precision. All of it present in a face that was entirely and already its own. The years that followed built themselves on that foundation with the particular solidity of things that have been constructed honestly. The cattle operation grew. The south pasture became productive. The second barn went up in 1885 and was used, and a third was discussed by 1887. Dusthaven grew too, slowly and without drama, the way places grow when they are not being hurried, and the Talmadge Ford property became known throughout the county as one of the better-run operations in the region, which produced a satisfaction for both of them that was quieter and more lasting than any single moment of success. Clara Brent's husband established a small operation of his own east of town, and the two families became genuinely close, their children growing up between the two properties with the ease of children who have been given good ground. The pastor's wife eventually returned to her primary vocation of being a teacher rather than a pastor's appendage, and she turned out to be a remarkable one, and Abigail had more than once sat at the back of the schoolroom and listened and thought about the ways that people become their real selves when the circumstances finally permit it. The Garcia family's land was returned through the court case in 1885, after Crane's conviction on the fraud charges, which resulted in a fine and 2 years in the county jail, after which he left Carville County entirely for territory unknown and ceased to be anyone's concern. Abigail read about this too in the Gazette, and she thought about the Garcia family having their land back, and she thought about the 2 other families, and she understood that for some of them the restitution was incomplete, that years of displacement could not be undone by a court order. But incomplete justice was still justice, and she chose to receive it as such, which was not the same as being satisfied with it. Earl Purcell retired as sheriff in 1886. The relationship between him and Abigail had achieved, over time, approximately what she had predicted: a functional, civil, mutually respectful distance. She did not invite him to the celebration the town organized for his retirement, and he did not expect her to, and there was an honesty in that mutual understanding that was, in its own way, more respectful than pretending. In the spring of 1887, their third child arrived, another boy, born in March with the early wildflowers already coming through the south pasture and the creek running high from winter rain. They named him Thomas Emmett Ford, Thomas for no particular reason other than that it seemed like a name for a person who would be solid and reliable, and Emmett because Abigail wanted her father's name present in the family again, in a different position, a different generation. Thomas was born into a house that already knew itself, a property that already had its rhythms and its stories, parents who had found their real shapes in each other, and a brother and sister who were already, at ages 4 and 3, complex and interesting and occasionally exhausting human beings. On the evening of the day Thomas was born, when the house was quiet and Clara was asleep in her room and Emmett was asleep in his, and the baby was in the cradle, Micah had moved to the bedroom, and the lamp was turned low, Abigail lay in the dark and listened to the property around her. She heard the creak. She heard the horses in the barn, the small movements and resettlings of the night. She heard her husband's breathing beside her, steady and even, the breathing of a man who had found, against considerable odds and through considerable difficulty, the place where he belonged. She lay in the dark and thought about the woman she had been in October of 1882, sitting at the kitchen table with her father's rifle in front of her, and a threat in her pocket, and the silence of the property pressing in. And she thought about what that woman had done with all of it. And she thought that woman had done well, better than she had perhaps given herself credit for in the doing of it. She reached out in the dark and found her husband's hand. He stirred, not fully awake, and his fingers closed around hers. She lay there with her hand in his and the baby breathing in the cradle and the property dark and quiet around them. And she thought, this is what you build when you do not give in and do not give up and do not give your land or your dignity or your honest letter writing to a man who only wants to take. This is what comes after the threats and the court sessions and the 3 nights on the porch in the cold October dark. This is what the word home has always been trying to say. Outside, the October stars were winter stars now, the great wheel of them turning over the Texas flatlands the way it always had and always would, indifferent to the small, essential dramas being lived beneath them. The creek ran on. The cattle stood in the cold. The painted mare Dollar stood in the barn where she had always stood, older now, slower, but still present, still watching, still the smartest thing on 62 acres by anyone's reckoning. And inside the house that Emmett Talmadge had built and Abigail Talmadge had kept and Abigail and Micah Ford had made into something larger and more alive than either of them could have arrived at alone, the lamps burned low against the dark, and 3 children slept, and 2 people lay still in the honesty of what they had built, and the night held everything it was meant to hold. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, the whole of what a life could be, when you decided to write the true letter, and someone decided to come, and he turned out to be the man who would sit on your porch in the cold and choose, without being asked, to stay.